So, this story comes from a Reddit user who shared their experience of living in one of the most remote parts of Scotland, Caithness, specifically the town of Thurso. They described it as the northernmost town on the British mainland, where the sea is wild, the winters are harsh, and unsettling things sometimes wash ashore. The original poster, or OP, said they'd always dreamed of living in the Scottish Highlands. When their dad bought an old house in this remote coastal town, they jumped at the chance to move. The beautiful landscapes, the promise of spotting dolphins and orcas, even the chance to see the northern lights. It sounded like paradise. But OP quickly realized this place wasn't the idyllic dream they'd imagined. What they described wasn't just eerie, it was downright disturbing. And today we're diving into the strange, creepy things they found washed up on the shore. When OP first moved to Thurso, they were excited to explore their new surroundings. Everything about the town seemed so different from their life back in Yorkshire. The rugged cliffs, the crashing waves, and the sheer vastness of the North Sea made Thurso feel like an entirely different world. OP loved taking their dog Maisie on long walks along the coast. Maisie, a sprightly black and white border collie, had boundless energy and a nose for adventure. They often wandered off the beaten path, exploring hidden trails and venturing down to the rocky shores below the cliffs. On this particular day, a couple of months after OP moved to Thurso, the weather was far from ideal for a walk. The sky was a dull slate gray, and the wind was relentless, whipping the waves into frothy whitecaps and pushing sheets of rain sideways. But OP had been feeling restless. The isolation of living in such a remote place was beginning to set in, and they hoped a brisk walk would clear their head. The trail they followed was rough and narrow, winding along the edge of a steep drop. Below, the sea churned violently against the rocks, the sound of the waves nearly deafening when the wind shifted just right. Maisie seemed unfazed by the weather, bounding ahead and stopping occasionally to sniff at something hidden among the grasses. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the cliffs opened up to reveal a stretch of bedrock that sloped gently down to the water's edge. OP decided to climb down, drawn by the rugged beauty of the spot. The rain was starting to ease up, though the wind remained strong, carrying a faint fishy smell that grew stronger as they approached the rocks. At first, OP didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The bedrock was slick with seawater, strewn with seaweed and the occasional empty crab shell. Maisie ran ahead, her nose low to the ground, zigzagging across the rocks in search of some new and exciting scent. But then, OP saw it. It started with a single bird, small and white, its body limp and lifeless, lying in a shallow pool of water. They paused, a pang of sadness tugging at their heart. It wasn't uncommon to find dead birds along the coast, especially after a storm. But as OP looked around, they realized this wasn't just one bird. The bedrock was littered with them. Dozens of seabirds scattered across the rocks like fallen leaves. Some were huddled together in groups, their wings twisted at odd angles. It wasn't until the next day that OP learned the truth about the birds. They'd been walking through town with Maisie when a woman approached them. OP couldn't help but notice the resemblance, the same sleek coat, the same alert ears. It was uncanny. The woman called out to them across the street, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. The woman crossed the street, her dog trotting obediently at her side. "There's a sign up by the trail," she said. "It's warning dog walkers to keep their dogs on a lead. There's bird flu going around, that's why all the seabirds are dead. It can spread to dogs, so you'll want to be careful." OP felt their stomach drop. Bird flu. That explained the strange and unsettling scene they'd stumbled upon the day before. The woman nodded, giving Maisie a sympathetic glance before continuing on her way. Her dog turned to look back at OP as they walked away, its dark eyes unreadable. For the rest of the day, OP couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, OP found themselves lying awake, replaying the events of the day in their mind. The dead birds, the woman, her dog, it all felt connected somehow, like pieces of a puzzle they couldn't quite fit together. But deep down, OP couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. As the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, OP wondered what other secrets this remote, windswept place might be hiding. The beach at Thurso wasn't exactly a place of idyllic beauty. For OP, it was more of a spot to stretch their legs and let Maisie, their border collie, run free. The town's beach was long and narrow, bordered on one side by the cold waters of Thurso Bay, and on the other by low rocky cliffs. It was often blanketed with thick piles of seaweed, which gave off an overpowering stench of sulfur and attracted relentless swarms of flies and midges. OP had never liked the beach much, but Maisie loved it. One summer day, OP decided to take Maisie for her usual romp along the shore. It had been a humid, overcast day, the kind that felt heavy and oppressive. The sea was unusually calm, its surface glassy and gray, blending into the fog that hung low over the horizon. OP let Maisie off her leash as they walked along the damp sand, the dog darting back and forth between the piles of seaweed, sniffing enthusiastically at the ocean's offerings. At first it was a normal walk. OP kept their eyes on the ground, stepping carefully to avoid the slimy tangles of seaweed and the occasional sharp edge of a broken shell. The only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the waves and the distant cry of gulls overhead. But then, Maisie froze. OP looked up and saw her standing stiffly a few yards ahead, her head low, her ears pricked, and her tail straight. She had found something. "Maisie, what is it?" OP called, walking toward her. Maisie didn't move, her gaze locked on a pile of seaweed that looked no different from the others at first glance. But as OP got closer, they noticed something sticking out of the tangled mess, something pale and smooth. It was a bone. OP's steps faltered, a cold prickle running up the back of their neck. Maisie stood guard over the pile, her nose quivering as she sniffed at the strange object. OP approached cautiously, their breath catching as they took in what lay before them. It was a skeleton. The upper half of the skeleton was entirely stripped of flesh, its bones stark white against the dark green of the seaweed. The lower half, however, was intact. The legs were still covered in thick, wet fur, and the hooves were smooth and polished, as though the tide had just delivered it to the shore. At first, OP thought it was a sheep. There were plenty of farms in Caithness, and it wasn't uncommon for farm animals to fall into the sea and wash up on the beach. But something about this skeleton felt wrong. The way it was lying, sprawled out with one arm and one leg on each side, gave it an oddly human-like shape. Winter in Thurso was brutal. The days were short, the nights were long, and the freezing wind seemed to cut right through you. For OP, it was a particularly difficult time. Life had grown heavier, and they found themselves taking long walks more often, hoping to clear their mind and shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled over them. Boxing Day that year was no different. OP had decided to go for a long hike along the coast, one of their favorite routes despite the season's unforgiving weather. They packed a small lunch, grabbed their coat, and set out early in the morning. The day passed in a blur of gray skies and rocky terrain, the wind howling constantly as they trekked along the cliffside trails. By the time they decided to head back, it was already evening, and the weak winter sun had dipped below the horizon. The beach was silent and still as they walked along the shore, the sound of the waves muffled by the dense fog that had rolled in. That's when they saw it. Ahead of them, just outside the reach of their flashlight, was a dark shape in the sand. OP squinted, trying to make it out. At first, they thought it was a rock, washed up by the tide and half buried in the sand. But as they got closer, the shape became more defined, and a sense of unease prickled at the back of their neck. It wasn't a rock. As OP approached, their flashlight revealed the shape for what it really was, a seal pup, a dead one. The skin where its head should have been was still intact, lying flat against the sand like an empty sack, but there was no bone beneath it. They stared at it, frozen in place. What could have done this? At first they thought it might have been a boat. A propeller could have struck the pup, leaving a wound like that. But the more OP looked at it, the less that explanation made sense. There was no sign of tearing or shredding, no blood soaking the fur. The flashlight's beam began to waver as OP's hand shook. They took a step back, but as they did, the light caught something else. A second shape, just a few yards away. It was almost identical to the first. The same small body, the same lifeless pose, the same missing skull. OP's breath came in shallow gasps as they took another step back, the sand crunching under their boots. The flashlight beam trembled as OP turned and began walking quickly back toward the trail. They didn't stop until they'd climbed back up to the cliffs, their breath fogging in the freezing air. When OP got home that night, they couldn't stop thinking about what they'd seen. In the days that followed, OP tried to find an explanation. They searched online, hoping to uncover some logical reason for what they'd seen. But both seals, with identical wounds in the same spot? It felt too deliberate, too precise. By the time spring rolled around, OP knew they couldn't stay in Thurso much longer. The dead seabirds and eerie skeletons had been disturbing, and the headless seal pups had left OP shaken, but it wasn't just the things washing up on shore that made life in Thurso unsettling. Over time, OP began to feel like the entire town was cloaked in a strange, heavy energy, something that was hard to put into words but impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the isolation, though the town's remoteness didn't help. At first, OP had been charmed by the rugged beauty of the place. The cliffs, the sea, the endless skies, it all felt so different from their old life in Yorkshire. But as the months turned into years, that beauty began to feel like a facade. It was Boxing Day, 6 months after OP had found the seal pups. A cluster of crumbling stone houses stood at the edge of the cliffs, their empty windows staring out at the sea like hollow eyes. OP's breath fogged in the cold air as they approached the settlement. The place felt wrong. Then they saw the van. It was parked on the far edge of the settlement, near what looked like the remains of an old round tower. One of the men turned, his gaze locking onto OP from across the ruins. OP didn't wait to see what they were burning. Gripping Maisie's leash tightly, they turned and headed back the way they came. OP then reached the beach, but it was nearly dark. The fog had thickened, and the beam of their flashlight barely cut through it, and then they saw it. Another dark silhouette, lying just ahead on the beach. It wasn't a seal, it was an animal, but one they couldn't immediately identify. OP gagged at the sight, the sharp tang of decay filling their nose. Maisie barked suddenly, her ears pinned back as she stared out into the fog. When OP finally made it home that night, they locked every door and window in the house, their mind racing with questions they couldn't answer. But no matter how much they tried to reason it out, the sense of unease lingered. It wasn't until later that OP learned the truth about Thurso's darker side. By the time OP decided to leave Thurso, the strange events had taken their toll. Even now, years later, OP still thinks about those days. And while they can't explain everything they saw, they know one thing for certain: they'll never go back.